The early people of Wales really begins approximately 30 to 40,000 years ago, and they would be described as Grimoldis. Grimoldis are prehistoric Africans that existed who migrated out of Africa into Europe, Asia, Russia, Australia, etc. And they were the first indigenous populations in the British Isles.
We have some evidence of the early peoples living around the coast, and along the Severn Estuary we can still see footprints of those early people embedded into the mud. It was a tribal civilization, small groups of people living in camps across Wales.
It would have been a clan group, clan mentality, a tribal group. People would always identify themselves to a family, an extended family, which had been a tribe. And as time started developing, new migrations started to come to this country. So we look at like the Celtic tribes, and they would have mixed with the indigenous dark-skinned populations of the British Isles, you know, bringing about that amalgamation and obviously lighter-skinned people.
The local tribal group were the Silures. They lived along the coastal fringe of South Wales and into the hinterland. It changed when the Romans got here around about 55 BC, and then things changed dramatically, really. They were conquering all the known world. They came to exploit minerals. You can still see Roman gold mines in Wales. They were here for hundreds of years. They brought Roman civilization into Britain.
When other invasions came, when the Vikings came over, they had imposed a particular social structure. Other invasions came over. These Germanic tribes literally came over, conquered Wales, and they conquered Scotland, and they started to call it England later on. By the stealing of lands in this country, they would have implemented the landlord system in the estate system, and they would have turned the indigenous people, or the local people rather, into serfs or peasants. They were the ones where the landlords, for instance, at least the aristocracy, would have relied on. The peasantry had to basically work all the time in order to keep the hierarchical structure in order. Because of what took place with Wales, with the English taking over Wales and occupying Wales, they tried to make the Welsh people forget their language. And when people forget their language, they forget their identity. They also forget their heritage.
From early times, it was very much a mixed economy. Agriculture would have been a very important thing. You know, we've always grown sheep in Wales, for example, and we've done that for thousands of years. There's always been a tradition of mining in Wales. In prehistory, this will have been mining things like iron ore, copper and tin. In the earliest form of mining, that farmers would dig coal on their own land at quiet times when they weren't farming their crops or animals. They would just go and dig some coal as an extra source of income. Wales has been a maritime trading nation for a long, long time. With the expansion of the British Empire, Welsh goods were exported all over the world. The big local family in Newport, the Morgan family.
One of the richest and oldest of all the Welsh families, the Morgans had a massive estate, 90,000 acres. They owned 1,000 farms, and then they found coal and iron on it as well.
They were related to Captain Henry Morgan. I don't know if you're a rum drinker, but Captain Henry Morgan appears on a bottle of rum.
He was actually an indentured servant, because what was happening at that time, when the Europeans had discovered so-called the Americas, one of the things that they were doing, they were letting their own vagabonds and prisoners out. He actually made it up through the ranks of piracy, etc., and become a respectable individual.
They say the greatest pirate in British history was Captain Morgan. But if you called him a pirate, you wouldn't want to do that to his face, because he hated that. It was like an insult. He was a privateer, basically a licensed pirate. Charles II gave him a license, a letter of marque, so he could attack Spanish ships in the Spanish Main.
He became the second governor of Jamaica, and it was him that really opened up trade for Wales.
And they wanted to court-martial him, but in the end they knighted him and made him a hero instead.
And that's how he got the name Sir Henry Morgan.
He had a very important role in Jamaica. I think he was the Queen's or the King's representative. They certainly made their money out of sugar plantations, which was underpinned by slavery.
The Morgan family had owned most of Newport, Newport Road, Rumney and Clan Rumney. One of the things which was cultivated in Jamaica, besides molasses, was rum. And I have a strong belief that the word rum has a relationship with Rumney and Clan Rumney, which actually gives that aspect with Wales. And with the alcohol production, which was taking place in the so-called New World, they were being slowly transported into this country, along with sugar and along with cotton as well.
Slaves were brought into Britain through the 17th and 18th century.
When you look at the Morgan estates, there's evidence of slaves or Africans coming over here to become domestic servants.
There's a black servant there called Girolamo Bardaletti. Not a slave, a black servant. We don't know what Girolamo did, but he was quite an important figure here at Tredegar House in the 1720s. They paid him £5 a year, which was the wage for a senior servant, and they called him my master, Girolamo.
So it wasn't just places like Liverpool and Bristol. Even Cardiff and Newport had a small slave population as well.
Then those black populations would have settled in the country, but not in, they weren't brought in huge numbers at that point.
What was very common when a lot of these European or British people made a lot of wealth or immense wealth in the Caribbean island, one of the things in order to maintain their social status in this country was to build large manors to show their wealth and their power. Everyone seemed, even the peasantry within this country or within Wales, started to benefit from the slave economy. But what started happening eventually was that many of them would set up shop or set up manors in the Caribbean, basically felt they could do the same thing in Britain, in Wales, in England, and that's how industrialization started. Mass production and industrialization first began in the Caribbean islands.
The Industrial Revolution happened in Wales before anywhere else, primarily because the sea links were very good in Wales, particularly in South Wales, and the coal was very close to the sea. And back 200 years ago, it was much easier to move coal 200 miles by sea than, say, 20 miles overland with a horse and cart.
The history of Cardiff is based on coal. The South Wales valleys are, I suppose, full of coal, and coal was a commodity greatly needed.
The fact that the sea came right to the coalfield really underpinned the industrial boom in Wales.
Because they set up different ports, within Scotland, within Ireland, within Wales, within England, they would obviously trade amongst themselves, the different commodities and minerals which was coming into this country. And then what they started doing was exporting products which were producing here to the rest of the world. And that's how they were able to make their money. And that money then was preserved from one generation to another, so that wealth became inherited.
The Industrial Revolution meant a new class was created, really, and it was sort of middle class. People were rich, but they weren't the landed gentry of old, and new political ideas were becoming talked about. And I guess that this new middle class had a tendency to be more liberal in their views, and very often they were very religious, so they had some understanding of the rights of man.
The working class of Wales and even England were supporting the abolition of slavery within the Caribbean islands, because things were coming to light how the Africans in the Caribbean islands were actually being treated and under what conditions they would actually live in. And I think it only became to light because mining, and they were looking at their own conditions, so the empathy was starting to be felt amongst those workers.
So the question about freedom and people's rights began to be talked about, and so questions about things like slavery were debated. People were aware that these things were basically wrong, and every person has the right to be free.
The slave owners, the planters, the merchants, many of them had invested, what were equivalent to thousands, millions of pounds over the Caribbean islands. The ventures failed. They basically came back and tried to salvage as much things as possible.
A lot of the rich landowners had slaves in their households. I mean, they were almost used as a fashion statement during some periods.
Their former masters, owners would have died, they would have lost their form of employment, and they became part of the working class of this country. Many of them would have had to fight to retain their freedom because they were the properties of the children. You would have had court cases, etc., of Africans or black people from the Caribbean islands trying to fight for their freedom, fight to stay over here.
This relates to some of the political activity that happened in Newport a little bit later. For instance, the Chartist movement. Again, this is very much a town-based movement where people began to question the political order, and everybody in society should have a say in how that society was run.
The Chartist movement came around about the 1830s, and it basically crystallized as a result of the conditions many of the workers had faced. They wanted decent pay for the decent day's work. They were looking for better living conditions, working conditions, because unfortunately for many of the industrialists, their concern was basically about making money. They didn't care about the conditions because people were dying every single day.
There had been some violent revolutions in France back in the 18th century, and that certainly frightened a lot of the rich people in Britain. So they slowly began to grant people greater rights in society through the whole of the 19th century.
So the Chartist movement basically came to try to speak out against this injustice, this economic injustice they felt they were facing.
Wales had become the first industrial nation in the world where more people were employed in industry than were employed in agriculture, and that's the first time that had happened anywhere in the world. There was a political movement to ensure that every man had a vote, that you didn't have to own property to vote, that people would be paid as MPs because then ordinary people could afford to be MPs. And these are the points that underpin the 6 points of the Charter. Locally, that there was an enthusiasm for Chartism amongst the local townsfolk in Newport and in the South Wales Valley towns. Of course, this came to a tragic end when a group of Chartists marched down into Newport in 1839 and were shot outside the Westgate Hotel. But the Chartist movement continued. There was such a gathering of people in the 1850s in London that the Queen had to move out to the Isle of Wight because they thought the country was on the point of revolution. Gradually, Parliament introduced greater rights to people over the next 50 years, and the enthusiasm for Chartism waned as these rights were introduced.
Tiger Bay is called Bute Town in honour of the second Marquis of Bute. When the Marquis of Bute wanted to export Welsh coal to the four corners of the world, these little docks in the centre of town were not sufficient for the purpose, so he decided he would build a new dock here at the seafront. But in order to do that, he'd come up against a problem: Chartist rebellions, upheavals of workers against the landlords and the toll booths. And as a consequence, he couldn't find a local labour force in order to build Cardiff docks. So he came up with a brilliant idea of going to Ireland and importing 200 Irishmen into South Wales. And these became the major navvy force that actually began the digging of the first dock. The dock opened up in 1836 and thus began the exportation of Welsh anthracite coal to the four quarters of the world. That was to transform Cardiff from an insignificant village into a town, then a city, and then subsequently the capital of Wales.
The golden age of the Welsh coal industry, just prior to the First World War, just after 1900, for example, the world price of coal set in Cardiff.
We got a building in Cardiff, which is the coal exchange, where coal was actually traded right across the world. And the first £1 million cheque was ever written in Cardiff as a result of selling and trading coal.
There was a time when, where we're actually sat now, if you looked out through that window, all you would have seen was hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of coal wagons. It used to be brought down from the Welsh valleys on the backs of mules, donkeys. And in later years, along comes the railway, and the railway then carried the coal.
The growth of unions, something that happened at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century as part of a movement really fighting for labour rights in all industries.
Trade unionists and working people, all they ever want is justice, equality, and they want fairness.
It happened in the coal industry that there was a federation movement which later formed into the unions. All the big industries started to become unionised.
When you have a mine, you have a community. And the community is based around the pit. If you take on one miner or one of the valleys, you take on the whole village.
The factory owners, the industrialists didn't want this, and they tried their very hardest to suppress unionism.
The coal began to be exported, get known, it expanded. People came here and Cardiff began to grow, which I suppose is why my great-great-grandfather came here, because Cardiff was the place to be.
As a consequence of the industrial activity, the wealthy people moved away from the seafront and started to build the rest of Cardiff, moving their homes there. And their major homes, single-family dwellings, were converted into seamen's boarding houses. Now, when the ships went out, they went to the four corners of the world, to China, to South America, to Africa, and everywhere. And when the ships returned, many of the crew on these ships were natives of those countries. And they began to come to South Wales and discover the growing community that was here.
The interesting thing about Cardiff is that it was what was called a tramp steamer port. A tramp steamer might go from Cardiff to Cape Verde off the coast of West Africa. Then it might go to somewhere, a port in Nigeria. Then maybe it goes to Angola or South Africa. Then it might go across the Atlantic to South America, to Argentina or something. It might then go up to Galveston, Texas. It might then go to New Orleans or someplace like that, up the east coast of America, and go to Newfoundland and then back across. So while the ship is in South Africa or wherever it is, you can get off, and Seamen sometimes took cameras and so on. They would visit things. It was an interesting way to see the world.
The sailor's life is very, very hard. If you're at sea, you can have waves hitting a ship higher than your house with enough force to actually buckle plate steel. They have to be on that ship from the port to a port, working in all kinds of winds and weathers. If you're out at sea and you're hitting waves and you've got a gale blowing, you can't exactly go indoors and wait for it to stop. It's a very dangerous, very hard life and taking into account that they're away from their families from anything from 6 to 9 months.
So even though they were paid badly, and even though they were discriminated against in terms of wages, like they made less than the white seamen, but if you talk to most black people who went to sea, they loved it. That's the way they talk about it.
They would marry local women, either English, Irish or Welsh women, and create families here, and this was the seed that created what would be Tiger Bay.
My great-great-grandfather, Walter Sinclair, came from Pennsylvania, yeah? So when he came to England, it was in 1878. He was shanghaied as a boy, and by the time he came here, he was 24 years old. Shanghaied, right, means that when he was a boy, he was taken on board ship, and then he stayed on board ship, and by the time he came off, he was a man of 24. He was able to then come off ship, so he came from London and travelled down to Bristol, where he met my great-great-grandmother, Beatrice Ashford, who was a white lady. So they must have fell in love and travelled from Bristol to Wales, because of the different cultures that we had here in Wales. You know, people coming back and forth all the time to Cardiff Bay because of it being such a big shipping port.
The Somali community were the big community, mostly of seamen. They had restaurants, cafes, and mostly went to sea. Sometimes they went for 6 months, maybe 2 years, down to Australia and came back.
I was born in Cardiff in 1951. My father's father was from the Cape Verde Islands, a group of islands off the west coast of Africa. And my mother's father was from Yemen, Aden. Both came over, both married English women. One from, my mother's mother was from Stoke-on-Trent, and my father's mother was from Bristol. My father's father continued to be a sailor. He continued to go to sea. Eventually, on my mother's side, my grandfather settled down, brought up the family, or helped to bring up the family, lived down the docks. Both of my grandparents lived down the docks.
In Tiger Bay, as we called it then, not Butetown, and it was great. Every door seemed to be always open. There seemed to be always people out on the streets. There seemed to be always things going on. You get to know all kinds of things about the world because your friends are from different countries.
So there might be two families next to each other. One of them might say that I'm West African. The other might say I'm Norwegian. But the women might both be from nearly the same village. And so that's absolutely crucial to it. And so the kids are moving around between cultures.
Everybody mixed. Everybody mixed and everybody knew everybody else. It was a pleasure growing up in Tiger Bay.
It was both multicultural and intercultural in a very small space. So the whole community was only a quarter of a mile wide, a mile long. In various periods, it had from 5,000 to 10,000 people in it. And those people were from something approximating about 50 nationalities, from Western European countries, from the Southern Europe, from Northern European countries, from the Far East, from the Middle East, from North Africa, from West Africa, and from South Africa, South America, from the Caribbean, North America. The distinction between social integration and economic integration. So there was a considerable social integration. You might have white friends or black kids go to the Greek church and so on, right? But then if you say, well, what happens in terms of employment? Well, black people always fared badly in Cardiff.
Living down here, we were used to foreign people. We accepted foreign people, but we were a special part of Cardiff. The rest of Cardiff wasn't like that.
If you were from this community, you had very little success in town. So it's quite important to think of this area as a kind of cosmopolitan island. On the south was the sea, on the east was the railway wall, the west was the Glamorganshire Canal, and the north was the railway bridge. So it was literally bounded on all four sides. And people very rarely went into town. Certainly the men almost never went in. their wives would go shopping in town because they would often get abused and so on. So they lived in harmony-ish down here, but that didn't necessarily extend to town.
It's well known that Cardiff was the site of the first race riots in Britain.
The Chinese were the first non-white people to settle here. People of Oriental descent were seamen like everybody else, but if they lived on the land, they were only permitted to run a restaurant or a laundry. They could do no other work by law. But because everybody needed their clothes washed and what have you, these became thriving little businesses, and as a consequence, they became quite well-to-do. And like anybody else who was upwardly mobile, they wanted to move out of the area and get a nice little home somewhere else. So they began to move out of Tiger Bay, but something sparked an anti-Chinese situation, and riots took place within Cardiff, not in Tiger Bay, and their businesses were smashed up, windows put in, and the Chinese were forced to move back into Tiger Bay, which they did, and then they set up their businesses along Bute Street.
The First World War had a huge impact locally, partly because it had a devastating effect on the young male population. Huge numbers of people were killed in the First World War. At the end of the First War, everybody was very tired, and we began to see a depression that lasted through the 20s, had a devastating effect, whereas the factories were very important during the war, suddenly they were closing down. The coal industry in Wales began to suffer very badly. The mines were closing, there was a sort of natural decline in mining. The coal that was left was harder to get, more expensive to get. There was unemployment on a large scale by the end of the 20s.
The 1920s and 30s were very, very difficult. Some people apparently, even in Cardiff and Newport, may have literally starved to death.
A lot of money had been made out of Wales, and there had been no reinvestment in something to follow those industries. The money was taken out during the good times, and there was never anything done to support Wales during the bad times.
When the soldiers were coming back, were being demobbed from the war, they found the situation was dire because there was a great increase of unemployment in the area and in the shipping industry. Because of the war effort, women came out of the kitchen and worked to build ammunitions and so on and so forth in our factories.
Women moved into jobs that men would have previously had, working in factories and so on. And men who are from the colonies, who are West African, West Indian, Somali, Arab, that moved into shipping jobs.
My nana in 1930, who at the age of 15 went into service, and the man of the house took advantage of my grandmother. So my mother was born out of wedlock, and to the man who my nan looked after their children.
White British males who have been in the army and come back home and seek to reclaim the jobs that they think belong to them. They also seek to reclaim the women that they feel belong to them.
When these white men came back from the war and saw black men working, instead of blaming the government, they blamed the unemployment on black people. So riots, anti-black riots took place in Cardiff. Where my grandparents lived, they were vulnerable because there were only 3 black families on Somerset Street. 1,000 white men raided the homes of 3 Negroes on Somerset Street. Well, one of those Negroes was my grandfather, James Augustus Headley. When they raided that street, one of the rioters realized that my grandfather didn't own this house and that the person who owned it was somebody they knew. So that was the only reason the house didn't get burned down. Those same rioters tried to come and do the same thing to the people in Tiger Bay.
There was a carriage going either from Butetown into town or coming the other way, and it was black men and their white wives and girlfriends and mixed-race children. And they are attacked by a group of white men, very near the train station. And one of the things we know from the police records, it's quite horrible, is that some of the women who were on the carriage had previously been prostitutes, and that some of the white men who were attacking them had been pimps. These are white males trying to recover white women who had literally been enslaved to them in some sense, who have now found a new life with black men. So one of the things that happens is the police have cannons on the bridge, but they don't put them facing the white people who are coming to attack black people. The cannons were facing into Butetown.
And the police told the rioters, if you go into this community, you go at your own risk, because down in Loudon Square, the largest population of Africans in the whole of Wales was located here, and they had built an arsenal, and everybody had their weapons and everything was waiting for them. The Chinese gave all our women pepper. And when the white men did break the police ranks and ride down Bute Street on horses, they threw the pepper into the street, and the horses reared up, and the rioters came down, and there was war. And they got it. And so this is perhaps one of the reasons Tiger Bay has a negative reputation, because we had the nerve and the audacity to fight people who didn't want us here.
So it reinforced a sense of community that was multiracial and together inside. Right? It wasn't a black against white thing. It was a black and white inside against the white from outside. In terms of the official story of Cardiff, the city fathers would often say things like how many thousands of mixed-race children and families there were in Cardiff. That was seen as something to be proud of.
The Second World War had a profound effect on the country as a whole.
Any dock area would have been an important place for the enemy to destroy. Cardiff was targeted by the Luftwaffe. There was a munitions factory just along the road from where we're sat at this present moment.
Kerns used to make bathtubs and stuff, but during the war, they made armaments for the war effort. And so because the men were gone, a lot of women worked in the munitions factories. So we have a story about Vera Roberts Johnson. Vera's father was from West Africa, and mother was English. One day she went as a teenage girl to get a job there. And she said all the girls in front of her and all the girls behind her got the job. She didn't. She was the only brown one. The others were white. So.
There were a great many American soldiers, and Tiger Bay would have been a place that the black-coloured soldiers came because of the mixed racial connotations of Tiger Bay. They were forbidden to come down here, but they came here nonetheless. They came in somehow. They made friends, they married a lot of girls from down here.
One of the results of the Second World War was the country was practically bankrupt in paying for all the weapons of the Second World War. To try and do something about this, the government wanted to try and maximise industrial output as far as they possibly could, but there was a manpower shortage that put a brake on how fast the economy could expand, and the government actively encouraged people from the colonies to move to Britain, and there was quite a movement of people from the Caribbean to Britain during this time. You know, we see Afro-Caribbean communities establishing in most of the major cities.
The plantocracy over the Caribbean was really, really harsh on the people. Most of them didn't know about Africa or didn't know Africa, so they felt safe coming here, you know, and mixing with the working class population of this country.
We see the establishment of these Afro-Caribbean communities, and it really had a cultural impact in Britain at the end of the 50s and into the 1960s.
My father came over here to Wales. He came on a boat as well, travelled from the West Indies, from St Kitts. He docked in Southampton and then travelled down to Cardiff in 1954. And my mother was already living down Tiger Bay as a married woman to somebody else. So I know that my parents had an affair, so I was a love child. So I was conceived in love in Cardiff, down Tiger Bay, and then they moved to Newport, where my mother gave birth to me in 1955.
My mother was from Newport, my father was from South Shields, which is up Newcastle way. He was at sea with my grandfather, on the same ship as my grandfather. He came to Newport when the ship docked in Newport. He had nowhere to go, so my grandfather took him home. He met my mum. I was born in Newport. I was born in Pill, in a place called Church Street. I was born in the front room. I'm proud to say I was, born and definitely bred in Pill.
In Newport, there was only a handful of black families at that time, so you're kind of like stuck together.
The most thriving community when I was a kid was Pill.
You know, there was people coming off from the ships. Every corner there was a pub.
Because in Pill you had butchers, shoe shops, the stocking factory, greengrocers. We had our own cinemas, there was a plaza. When I was a kid, you never looked to go to town because everything you wanted was in Pill.
In 1954, when my father came, there was racial tension. that it would say no blacks, no dogs and no Irish.
When I first went for a job with the British Transport Police, I was called to a meeting not far from here, and the Chief Superintendent turned around and said to me, "You've applied for the police, we'll have black policemen one day, but that's not today."
Gwent had not had a big history of black officers before myself. I was one of the first in 1988. I got called names in work by colleagues. It's hard to say racism because they were colleagues and friends, but it was a time when it was quite openly acceptable. I've had to put up with it. Things have certainly changed a lot over the 30 years.
Growing up in a mixed race family, or mixed heritage as you now have to say, because you've got to be politically correct nowadays, it was weird. I can remember being 10 years old and we never had a granddad. But there was a granddad, but he was white. So we couldn't understand, how can that white man be our granddad? The shame that Nana had, because at 15 to go into service and then have that happen in such a short time wasn't good. One Sunday, there was this gentleman that my mum said, "Your grandfather's on telly this afternoon." She said, "So we're having a special occasion." And this man that my mother said was our granddad, as a black man, was Paul Robeson, who was a famous singer. But in order for my mother to be able to tell us something, who her dad was, the only black person that she could see at that time was Paul Robeson. And I always believed, up until I was an adult and actually found out who Paul Robeson was, that he wasn't my granddad.
I'm black. I can remember being coloured. When they changed me from being coloured to being black, nobody told me, so I was still calling myself coloured when everybody else was calling me black.
To me, I was half-caste. I'd always considered myself and heard the word half-caste, and then suddenly I became mixed race, dual heritage, dual parentage. Now it's all black and ethnic minority, black. It was really confusing to know, nobody else seemed to know, so how the heck was I supposed to know?
I described myself as a black Welsh woman who stands proud, because it must have took such a lot to get me here now through my foreparents.
The big thing in Newport was iron ore, and then it went to coal, and they started importing coal. And that was roughly round about just prior to the miners' strike. They started importing millions of tons of coal from the States and all the rest of it.
The bosses decided to take on the miners. It was through the strength of the trade unions that they eventually nationalised the mines.
It was a very strong passion within the working populations because, they were fed up with being treated unfairly.
Many of the men actually went on strike because they weren't happy with the conditions again, the pay which they were getting and the way they were treated by the Conservative government.
The unions become very powerful. It's almost said that they were running industries. They were running those industries for their members' benefits, not really focusing on the efficiency of those industries. So by the 1970s, Britain was left with quite a lot of uneconomic industries.
But of course, with community spirit, the one thing that we do have is that you have a political class who don't actually want communities to stick together, whether they're black communities, whether they're brown communities, whether they're Chinese communities, whether they're any community. If you stick together, you become a little bit of a threat to the bosses, to the managers, to the capitalist class. So eventually they decided that they would actually smash the mining industry.
The governments during the 70s didn't address some of the fundamental problems, but then of course in the 80s with Margaret Thatcher, who took on the trades unions, effectively closed down large parts of the steel industry, went almost to war with the miners' unions. There were almost pitched battles between the police and the miners' union members. Some of those scenes were almost like medieval battles. Orgreave Cokeworks, for example, is probably the most famous example of that.
The unions were more for the Labour Party, and one of the things that she wanted to crush the unions.
The result was that Margaret Thatcher won, the miners lost, and the mine industry almost closed over the next, couple of years. And the problem was there was a reasonable argument to saying these mines were uneconomic and we couldn't carry on subsidising the production of coal, but there was not a thought given to what would replace these mines in terms of employment. So particularly in South Wales, the coalfield region absolutely blighted with unemployment, almost a sense of hopelessness amongst the populations of, what would replace the mines? Nothing other than unemployment benefit.
When it got broke, it decimated the local communities because many of the men were out from work.
Well, heavy industry is taking a hammering, not just with the fact that the mines have closed, the steelworks have closed, and industry up the valleys have closed. So the wealth of Newport and Cardiff, Swansea, Barry, Penarth has been affected. It's Welsh people from all across the different communities who always have a determination to fight for themselves, to fight for their communities, to fight for their class. But the government tells us that we actually need to rebalance the economy. And if you go in Cardiff, no, you won't be seeing many miners on the streets, but you'll see lots and lots of coffee shops, pawn shops. I personally would prefer to see people having the opportunity for jobs rather than people having to struggle on a welfare system.
Cardiff Docks now is basically defunct. There's hardly anything in Swansea, so the only working actual general cargo port in South East Wales that's surviving and increasing is Newport.
It's not just an attack on trade unions, it's an attack on every working person within the country. And that has had a detrimental effect and still has a detrimental effect, not just on black families in Cardiff, but in families right across Wales and beyond.
The abolitionists, the Chartists and the growth of the unions, it's all one thing really. It's about rights for ordinary people. We see these granted slowly, but they were granted. And even now we're still fighting for some rights. The old traditional industries that underpin the growth of Newport in the first place have gone, and we're not going back to those days. Britain has become a service-led economy. We'd like to see more service industries set up in Newport, but also, the country cannot afford to turn its back on manufacturing.
Different cultures coming into the UK, coming into Wales, has had a massive impact, and I think it has been positive.
I think it's most important for us to celebrate other people's cultures and to also have our own. So from others, they educate us. Through food, we're educated. Through dancing, through their dress, through their expression of life, we're educated.
The issue of integration hasn't stopped. We can look at black and Asian immigration and the growth of their communities. They're obvious because, they're black people and Asian people. At the moment in South Wales, new immigrant communities from Eastern Europe perhaps immediately are not so apparent, but they're there as cultural groupings. So the melting pot continues and they will bring their own cultural influences, and it makes Britain what it is, which is a very diverse, culturally rich country.
So the world that we're living in now is all about integration, learning. And if we could live in a world that was peaceful, it would be amazing.